Welcome to our daily reflection for this Sunday, November 10th. And every Sunday is the Lord's Day. We give thanks and praise and we rejoice in Jesus' victory over death to save us and redeem us. And so it is a day marked by joy. And today, Jesus, and in the readings, we have two widows that kind of frame all of our readings today for the day. We start with an Old Testament story of Elijah and a widow who is a foreigner. And she's about to run out of her last food. And she's going out to collect sticks, to make a fire, to cook up the last of her flour and oil. And Elijah makes a bold request. He says, could you just make a little cake for me, a little bread? And she says, look, as the Lord your God lives. And so she recognizes Elijah's God and actually swears an oath by his God saying, I'm honest, I'm just going out to make my last supper. We're going to eat this meal and then we're going to die of hunger because there's a great drought and therefore famine on the land that Elijah prophesied, and it would last 3 years. So Elijah makes a bold promise. If you give me your last food, the Lord will provide for you. So think about, and I want us to slow down and really reflect on this reading. You know, here's this stranger, a prophet, a man of God from another people, from another God, and she has to trust his word. And so she has to act in faith to give up her last food, not only for her, but think about it for her son. There's nothing that a mother would rather do than to take care of her own children. And so she's got to put the word of God and this prophet ahead of her own child. That's really remarkable when we think about it. God's asking a lot from her, but she believes. She exercises remarkable faith, and she makes this meal for Elijah, and then she is able to, have enough flour to make a meal for her and her son, and her flour jar and her oil do not run out during the entire time of this drought and famine. She is able to be preserved because she was generous. And here's the beautiful thing. Because she sacrificed and was generous with all that she had, God blessed and made sure she never ran out. And so it's a remarkable thing. And then when we go to the gospel, we see that, many people are giving great sums into the treasury, and their coins are probably making a lot of noise as they're being dropped into this, into the treasury, as Jesus is watching them and the disciples. And then a widow comes and she gives 2 small coins, probably not making much noise at all. But God notices, even if no one else does. God notices our smallest sacrifices, and they may be small in our eyes, but when they're sacrificial, they're big. And God takes note. And Jesus, observes this to his disciples. He says, look, this widow who just gave a few pennies, basically a couple coins, she donated more than all the rest because they gave out of their abundance, but she gave out of her poverty, all that she had. And so notice what God notices. He sees that when our giving is sacrificial, it becomes sacred, right? When our giving is sacrificial, it becomes sacred. It's not just giving out of the excess of what we have, which is one thing, but to give sacrificially is quite another. And that's a beautiful thing that she does. And Jesus notes it and notes that God notices such giving, and her reward will be great, right? And then we have the second reading today. And of course, even the Psalm 146, talks about how God will feed the poor and take care of them. We see that in the first reading with the widow and Elijah. But then we have the second reading. It's easy to miss how it connects with all of this because it's reading from the epistle to the Hebrews, speaking about Jesus as the high priest and how he goes into the temple not made with hands, the heavenly temple, through his ascension and death and resurrection. And he brings before God the Father his one sacrifice for all time, the sacrifice of himself. And notice that it's all about sacrifice in the readings today, this Sunday. Whether it's the widow with Elijah who sacrifices the last of her flour and oil that could go for her and her son, and she gives it to the man of God, or the sacrifice of the poor widow who gives her last pennies her whole livelihood, her last savings in the temple. And then we have the sacrifice of Jesus. He gives his whole livelihood. He gives the last of what he has. He makes a total gift of self on the cross. And he brings that as the high priest with his own blood before the Father in heaven. And that sacrifice will atone for all sin once and for all, which is a remarkably beautiful thing. And so we see how all these readings are all about sacrifice of self. And what we see is that when our sacrifice and our giving is sacrificial, when our giving isn't just out of surplus but sacrificial, that giving, that sacrifice becomes sacred and is observed and noted in God's eyes. And so today, let's imitate Christ, let's imitate the widows, and think about where God is calling us to sacrifice our time, our treasure, and our talents in a sacrificial way for the sake of others and the sake of God most of all. May the Lord bless and keep you.
This daily reflection is brought to you thanks to the generous support of the Mission Circle. Join the Mission Circle to help Catholics worldwide understand, live, and share their faith. Sign up at missioncircle.org today.